This podcast is not intended to provide any investment advice. The opinions expressed here by either the hosts or guests do not necessarily reflect the views of PSA, Collectors Holdings, or any of their affiliates. Any discussion of collectible values in the past or present is not a guarantee of future performance.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another week of the PSA Pod. Ryan Green and Steve Sloan coming to you, and we're going to call this a Back by Popular Demand episode. Back again joining us after first appearing on episode 20 is PSA Autograph Principal Authenticator Kevin Keating. Kevin leads PSA's autograph authentication team and has been a hobby stalwart for decades. As we discussed, he has a new book out. We talked about it in episode 20. It is called Waiting for a Sign Volume 2, Highlights and Inside Stories from a Lifetime of Collecting Baseball Autographs. The stories were incredible last time. And Steve, we couldn't be more excited to have Kevin back in here.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
This is going to be fun. We're gonna run it back, so to speak. We're going to dive right in with some Hall of Fame baseball content here. And, I'd like you to talk about your close friendship with Warren Spahn. Actually, due to your close friendship with the Hall of Famer, you actually have his final autograph that he signed before passing in 2003. And there's a really touching story about that autograph in the book that I encourage our listeners to read. But for today, I hoped, Kevin, that you could focus on celebrating Spahny's life by not speaking necessarily to his baseball accomplishments. Everyone knows he's the winningest left-handed pitcher in baseball history with 363 wins, but I'd like you to talk about the last 3 seasons to World War II. And this is a topic touched on a little bit in the first interview with you, but I'm just so fascinated by the fact that so many pitchers and players and hitters from that era lost baseball years to service time. And so I was hoping you could talk to a particular story from Warren Spahn's time in Europe during World War II, and specifically the key events that took place as part of the Battle of the Rhine.
Yeah, the Remagen Bridge. I had heard about that story from Chuck Connors the year before this took place. So I met Warren at a what was called a tribute to the Hall of Fame, and it was a fundraising event over 3 days. We stayed at the Waldorf Astoria. I paid money to be part of the event, but I was on the executive committee, so I had access to people, and I got to golf in the golf tournament. So I got into one of the pre-designated automobiles. They had drivers to take us out, and they said, go in that one. So I get in, the door opens and I get in. I'm sitting next to Pee Wee Reese in the back, and Roy Campanella's son-in-law is in the front. And Pee Wee turns to me, he touches my knee, and he says, I'm Pee Wee Reese. What's your name? And so, the day started off great. We got out, spent 45 minutes driving out there talking to Pee Wee, and mostly just listening to the two of them talk. And then we got out of the car and we got in a line to receive our gift bags before we, went out and had breakfast and then started the golfing day. And I turned around because I wanted to take it all in and see, who am I standing there? And Warren Spahn standing right behind me about a foot, in front of my face. And he looks at my cap, and I had this cap on that Chuck Connors had given me, and it said the Rifleman, and Warren says, the Rifleman, and he just read my cap. And I said, yes, sir. I said, in fact, a mutual friend of ours had given me this cap. And he goes, who might that be? And I said, Chuck Connors. And he said, oh, gosh, Chuck was such a great guy. We were such good friends. It was so sad when he passed away, last November, because Chuck had just passed away. And I said, yeah. And so we started talking and just kind of hit it off. And I told him a little bit about myself. Warren was a very curious person. So if you did engage him, he would engage you back. And he often tested people just to see how they would react to things. And I guess I reacted in a way that was positive to him, because we just kept talking. And at some point he said, you want to sit down and have breakfast together? And I said, sure. So we sat down and had breakfast together, and we already had become friends. People were coming up, like the Hall of Famers were walking by, and people would always pay homage to Warren, no matter who it was. Johnny Bench, Joe Morgan, Whitey Ford. Whitey was interesting that day because Warren had his back to Whitey, and Whitey's walking by and he goes, hey, how's the second winningest left-hander of all time doing over there? And Warren started laughing. He didn't even turn around. He said, oh gosh, that's Whitey. And Whitey comes up, and just like all the other Hall of Famers, he introduces Warren Spahn to his friend. He says, hey, Spahny, I'd like you to meet my friend, Joe, or whatever the guy's name was. He's like, Joe, I want you to meet Warren Spahn, the war hero. I must have heard that 5, 6, 7 times. They always referred to him as the war hero. And, Warren didn't pay any attention to that. But I knew about the story about the Remagen Bridge because Chuck had told me that story. And it was all, I'm a West Point graduate.
But Warren didn't like to talk about it, right?
He didn't like to talk about it.
Yeah.
And so at some point I felt comfortable enough. I wanted to hear the story from him. So I asked him, I said, Chuck Connors told me about how you had been at the Remagen Bridge when it went into the Rhine River. And I was wondering if you might, tell me about it. And he said, well, I don't normally like to talk about World War II or my service there, but being that you're a West Point graduate, I'll tell you about it. And he went through the whole story, and it was bone chilling, actually. And to make a long story short, I do go into more detail in the book, because I basically in the book, I write his words, his telling the story. But, the real takeaway is, he would say that, but for the grace of God, I'm here because he said, I was standing on the side of the bridge, just off the bridge, getting ready to assume guard duty on the bridge, because they would have people walking on the bridge, just looking for snipers because they were under attack for a week or so. And he said, I was taking my orders from the sergeant of the guard when all of a sudden all hell broke loose. And he said, we thought we were under attack and it was machine gun fire. But what it was we had overloaded the bridge with men and material. They were trying to get the bridge reinforced so that the Allied invasion could come across with all the tanks and all that stuff. And they had overloaded the bridge themselves, and the bridge collapsed. And he said, what we heard was it turned out it was the rivets shooting out of the bridge, and we all hit the ground. And he said most of my unit, went into the water and died. And he got a battlefield commission because of that. I mean, he was one of the few men left, and he was a buck sergeant at the time. But to this day, he's the only major league player to ever get a battlefield commission. So he served 3 years. When baseball resumed in, I should say baseball had never.
And this is prior to his playing real, like he had just was starting to come up, right? And he hadn't made a name for himself in the big league.
Right. He came up in 42 and he pitched 5 games. And ironically, he got sent down to the minors when he refused to throw at Pee Wee Reese's head. And Stengel had ordered him, Stengel was his manager with the Boston Braves, had ordered him to throw at Reese, and he refused. And Stengel said, man, if you're not going to throw at Pee Wee Reese, you don't have enough.
Probably deserved it.
Yeah. And he goes, well, if you're not going to throw at him, you don't have the guts to be a big leaguer. You're going down. And Warren had pitched in 5 games with no decision. And just speaking about Casey, when Warren gave his Hall of Fame speech, his first line was, because he played for Stengel in 42 in Boston when the Braves sucked. And then he played for Stengel in 65 for the Mets when the Mets sucked. And Warren famously said in his Hall of Fame speech, yeah, and I'd like to thank Casey Stengel, my first and last manager. I had the privilege of playing for Casey before and after he was famous because, of course, he had the intervening years with the Yankees, But getting back to Warren and the war, I can't even tell you the number of times I was with him at autograph signings and things, and people would say, gosh, Warren Spahn, you won 363 games. Think of how many you would have won if you hadn't had the war, to take 3 years of your life away. And he said, are you kidding me? He said, I wouldn't have been half the pitcher if I hadn't, gone to World War II. He said, because, that toughened me up and it made a man out of me. And he said, all the games that I would get shellacked and they'd have to take me out and I'd walk off the mound and I'd think to myself, it wasn't so bad.
Could be worse.
No one shot at me today, So he really had it. Yeah, he really had a perspective about it.
Yeah, that's a great story and greater detail in the book. Let's move on to another World War II veteran, a pilot from World War II who lost his right foot and lower leg 11 inches below his knee while flying near Berlin. And that is Bert Shepard, who is a name most probably baseball historians may not even know, but Kevin, you certainly know it. He was saved actually upon landing or crash landing by a German doctor from locals who discovered his wreckage, and then he went on to be held in a series of prisoner camps. But yet, despite all this, and the fact that, again, that he lost his foot and lower leg, he still went on to pitch in Major League Baseball. And then there's a funny anecdote from Yogi Berra that I think you could probably wrap up a really interesting story of Bert Shepard with.
Yeah, well, Bert had wanted to be a big league player. That was his dream, and he was certainly a solid pitcher before the war. And of course, the war took him away, and he became I think it was a P-38 aircraft pilot, and did a number of bombing missions over Germany. He was stationed in Great Britain, and on this particular afternoon, he had to fly over enemy territory in Germany, and he was shot down. He said he got he got whatever ground fire up through the bottom of his fuselage, and he looked down, and his right foot was barely hanging on by like a thread. And the next thing he knew, he was on the ground, passed out. He had passed out, and his plane had crashed, but he survived somehow. And he said, I woke up, and I was staring up at a number of angry Germans with pitchforks. The farmers had come into the field and were going to kill him. And he said there was a German doctor was there and basically saved his life. Twofold. One, by calling off the German farmers who wanted to kill him, and secondly, by actually putting a tourniquet around his leg and saving him that way. But I was at an event. It was actually the groundbreaking for the World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C., and the Smithsonian had invited a number of World War II baseball luminaries to come and do a fundraising event there in the city. And so I was spending the day with Warren, and that night we had a dinner, and Buck O'Neill was going to be there, and Bert Shepard was going to be there, Bob Feller, some others, Tommy Hendrick, as I recall. And so I'm sitting there with Spahny, and Bert Shepard walks up, and I knew all about Bert's background in this particular story. And he picked out Warren, and he said, excuse me, Mr. Spahn, I'm Bert Shepard, and I just wanted to shake your hand. I'm a big fan. And I said, oh my gosh, Bert Shepard. I said, Spahny, you know Bert's story? And Warren, whether he had known about it at any time, I don't know, but he certainly didn't know anything about Bert at the time. He didn't know who Bert was, or that Bert had been a baseball player or whatever. And so I invited Bert to sit down with us, and we spent the afternoon. And the first thing I did was I said, Bert, would you mind telling Warren about your war story? And he told Warren the whole story, and then how he came back, and he was part of a very high-level POW exchange in the spring of 1945. So the war is actually starting to wind down, right? But it's still very much alive. And I guess 6 U.S. soldiers were traded for some, German soldiers, and Bert Shepard was one of them that came back. And while he was in a POW camp, one of the British POWs had fashioned, basically a peg leg for him. And he kept throwing the ball, and he would play catch with, makeshift baseballs and things like that using this peg leg, which he said, the guy did remarkably well. It felt pretty good on the stump of his, I think it was his right leg. But in any event, he comes back, and he was at the Pentagon, and there were a lot of press people around, and they were interviewing the 6 soldiers, and, George Marshall, I think, who was the chief of staff of the Army at the time, was interviewing the soldiers, and he went around and he asked each one, what do you want to do now? And they got to Shepard, and Shepard said, well, I'd really like to resume my baseball career. So one of the writers thought it would be pretty cool if he helped set that up. So he called up Clark Griffith, who owned the Senators, and he said, Griff, I got a guy here, POW's missing part of his leg, but he wants to pursue a baseball career. Why don't you invite him to spring training? It'd be a great publicity thing for you guys to do. And Griff said, yeah, that's a great idea. So the next thing you know, Bert Shepard's at spring training in March 1945, and they brought him on the team as like a pitching coach. And in August of 45, in the thick of a pennant race, and I think the Senators were...
But no one really thought he was going to do anything beyond spring training.
Right.
It's more of like a publicity for the wars, wrapping up. We're the victors. This is, how we treat our veterans.
Exactly. Yeah. But Bert thought otherwise, right? Like he was pursuing his baseball career seriously, and he was good. He was good enough that they actually put him in a game in August 1945. I think the Senators had 3 doubleheaders in a row, like 3 days in a row. and they were just worn out. And
Different time.
yeah, and they were right, and they were.
There's not
What
6-game
were the
series
pitch counts
anymore.
in those?
No, and that's back when the starting pitchers would pitch like a whole game, and they didn't have a bullpen, right? So they bring Shepard in the third or fourth inning of a game against the Red Sox, and I think the first guy he faced was Bobby Doerr, and he got Bobby Doerr out, and I think he pitched about 5 innings, allowed 1 run, 3 hits, something. I mean, he had a good showing.
That's a pretty good recall. I just looked it up on his baseball reference page. 5 1/3, 3 hits, 1 earned run.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Great
one,
recall.
one leg.
One leg.
On one leg. Yeah. So he stayed with the Senators for a number of years as a coach. Never did get back in a big league game, but he would pitch batting practice every day, and he also would pitch in exhibition games.
And then Yogi Berra, like you got a good little Yogiism, so to speak, with that one.
Yeah. So Bert told us the story that day. He said, it's funny. He said, I would pitch. This is Bert talk. He said, I'd pitch. He's telling Spahny this. He's like, I'd pitch in these exhibition games, Spahny, and I didn't do that badly. He said, I struck out Yogi Berra one time, and he said the funny thing was, I met Yogi years later, and he remembered striking out against me, and he said, and he said, Yogi said to me, he said, Bert, if you hadn't lost that leg, you'd have been a pretty good pitcher, and Bert said, yeah, but Yogi, I'd already lost the leg when I struck you out. And Yogi kind of, scratched his head at that, but yeah.
That's perfect. All right. So next, you touched on him a little earlier by name, and that's Buck O'Neil. And if the listener doesn't know who Buck O'Neil is, you certainly know his smile, especially if you're a baseball fan that watched the documentary from Ken Burns, just aptly called Baseball. Buck O'Neil was the key narrator in the series for the history of the Negro Leagues, as one of the remaining players at the time in 1994. I personally have met Buck O'Neil, so I know firsthand that his infectious smile, his energy. Calling him an ambassador is probably an understatement in terms of being an ambassador to the game of baseball. Sadly, though, just prior to his death in 2006, he was up for Cooperstown Hall of Fame enshrinement, but he didn't make it. And there's some speculation whether he was just one vote short, which would be, just heartbreaking to make it even worse. But what Buck did next, I think, really speaks to what type of person he was. And Kevin, I'd like you to describe that, because you were actually at the Hall of Fame that year.
Yeah, I was a guest that year. And just to give a little more context, so the Negro League Committee, the first one, had put together, they were tasked with determining what Negro League players should go in the Hall of Fame, players and executives. And the original list was 30 people. And that was put together by a number of people back in like 1970, 71. And for many, many years, every year or two, back then, the first 2 they put in was the greatest pitcher, Satchel Paige, and the greatest hitter, Josh Gibson. That's kind of how they looked at it. And then from then on, they would just work down the list from there. And they got to a point where it was like, I think they'd hit 22 out of 30, because every year or two, they'd put another one in. And so once they got to the end of that list, at least historically, they had set out to put 30 in, and this was going to be the 30. But at some point around 22 people, they deviated and they put in Hilton Smith, and Hilton Smith hadn't been on the original list. And when that happened, it left a lot of the Hall of Famers kind of scratching their heads going, well, where did Hilton Smith come from? Like, what are his credentials? He wasn't on the original list. And so the Hall of Fame then kind of backed up and said, well, you know what? We're going to put a new committee together, and we're going to relook at this thing, and we're going to come up with a new list, because now we're going to do a much more expansive project to try to come up with all the data we can to statistically put together the Negro Leagues. Because in 70, 71, when they put the original list together, they did not have the kind of data that they've got now. So they went out and they mined this data from every record book they could. Now, in 70, 71, the original group of people that put the list together were people who had Wendell Smith, who had been a writer for the Pittsburgh Courier. All these people had seen the Negro Leagues. At least they'd seen them in the 20s and 30s. There were still people alive. But back in 2001, when all this happened with Hilton Smith, there was really nobody left, at least historians, who could talk to the Negro League. So they mined all this data. they took a hiatus and they put together a new list. And what they did was the original list was the original new list was over 100 people. Then they whittled it down to 37. And the Hall of Fame voted on 37 people with individual ballots. So all 37 could have gone into the Hall of Fame. In the end, 17 were voted in. 2 people were alive on that ballot of 37 in 06. It was Buck O'Neil and Minnie Minoso. Now, interestingly, Minoso got in this year as well. But so Buck, with all that said, Buck had a shot at the Hall of Fame. As you said, Steve, he missed it. I've been told it by 1 vote. But there was nobody alive who better represented the Negro League than Buck O'Neil. He was the voice of the Negro League, the ambassador of the Negro League. So Dale Petrosky, the president of the Hall of Fame at the time, he made the phone call and he said, Buck, you didn't get in, but there's nobody who can better represent the 17 who are going in than you. Would you mind giving the induction speech to bring these people into the Hall of Fame and give them a voice and give them life on this day?
Wow.
And of course, Buck O'Neil, being the kind of person he was, he's like, sure, I'd be honored to do that. And so that day it was a Sunday, when, the plaques are handed over to the family members or whomever, and these 17 Negro Leaguers were enshrined, and Buck O'Neil gave the speech, when they presented the plaques on stage. And just before
representing all the men who got in instead of him,
and the
front of him,
and the woman, because Effa
Wow.
Manley had gotten in that group. And so I went down in the lobby because when I'd be a guest there, I'd stay at the Otesaga with the players and their families, and I'd go down in the lobby on that day as the Hall of Famers would gather, and there'd be Sandy Koufax over here and Bob Gibson and Joe Moore, and so I would just kind of hang out and watch everybody, and I'd talk to this person or that person. So I see Buck sitting by himself, on one of the sofas, and I walked over, I sat next to him, and I patted him on the knee, and I said, hey, Buck, how you doing today? And he kind of looked wistfully, straight ahead, and he goes, I'm tired. And it was just such a strange thing coming out of his mouth, because I'd been with Buck multiple times. And as you said, Steve, he was so infectious and had so much energy and charisma and just warmth to him. And not that any of that was gone, except he certainly was pensive. He had a lot on his mind, and obviously he was severely disappointed. It was a difficult day for him in a lot of ways. But man, that guy rose to the occasion. I was there, 10 rows, in front of him as he gave his speech, and it was electrifying. That speech was electrifying, and it was unbelievable. One of the greatest, Hall of Fame induction speeches I've ever heard.
Worth the 7 minutes if you've got a few YouTube clicks to spare. It's on YouTube. You can watch it, and within it, you'll notice a really touching way that he closed the speech, which was asking the entire audience to join hands and sing together, which was such an inclusive and just a great way to bring everyone together, and recognizing as part of his speech the segregation that he and his fellow Negro League players had to endure. So he came over the top on it, and really, in terms of his graciousness to perform in that moment with the bitter disappointment still looming so large in his life. It's great that he was able to be inducted finally this summer.
Yeah, so he gets inducted this year, and I had to rewrite the end of my the end of that chapter, which I had written some time ago, but very happily so, I must say.
And we'll drop the link to that speech in the description below. So it's definitely worth taking the time to check out.
Yeah, it's a piece of baseball history, even off the playing field. Next, let's move over to Paul Gleason, probably a name that most people don't know off the top of their head, but they know his face. And of course, they know his most famous line from The Breakfast Club: "Don't mess with the bull, young man. You'll get the horns." And you can just see the visual. I can see Ryan over here doing his hook 'em horns signal there.
That's where I learned it, not from the University of Texas on TV, from watching The Breakfast Club.
So Paul Gleason's been in a number of different movies and TV shows, from Magnum PI to Dawson's Creek. You mentioned Van Wilder. He's a face that most Americans know, but you're close friends with him, Kevin. And through that friendship, you actually met Charlie Sheen, who's another iconic name inside of American pop culture, a huge sports collector as well. And you have some insights in terms of what Charlie was collecting in that time, and your relationship through Paul.
Yeah, well, Charlie was interesting in terms of his collecting, right? Because I mean, he went in feet first, and he was the whale that everybody knew about that was out there buying this stuff, and really he drove prices up, because if he wanted something, he was going to get it, and no one was going to outbid him. But people really bid against him, till they couldn't bid anymore. But Charlie, famously bought the Mookie ball, the ball that supposedly went through Buckner's legs in Game 6 of the '86 World Series, and also bought what was supposed to be Babe Ruth's 27 Yankees World Series ring. If it was an item like that, Charlie was going to wind up with it one way or another.
Yeah, there's some videos online. You can see, I think it was Leland's who actually sold his collection. Part of it as well, they marketed having the contract that sent Ruth from the Red Sox to the Yankees, which was owned by Charlie Sheen as well. But Charlie's just such an interesting character. His life has taken lots of twists and turns. But for him to start as a collector, not only a collector but a whale, it's pretty interesting callback to the hobby, and it just shows how sports connects people.
Yeah, you're right. And the thing about it is that this is back in around 2000 when Charlie kind of, late 90s actually, when Charlie really entered the hobby. And he gave credibility to the hobby, credibility that we hadn't had before Charlie got into it, because Charlie was such a big, well-known name. And man, if Charlie Sheen's going to collect this stuff, maybe it's not just all a bunch of, old screwball people who, are holding on to their past. I mean, it really kind of gave the hobby some gravitas that it hadn't had before and enjoyed.
Yeah, it's kind of like what's happening now.
Yeah.
People from, Logan Paul, Steve Aoki.
We just presented Post Malone back his custom 1-of-1 Magic the Gathering, card that Wizards of the Coast made for him. And, this is someone who played the game as a kid, and now he's this giant superstar, but he still has that connection to the game he grew up playing, is still very involved with it. And I think a lot of that, because of social media, you're seeing a lot more of this with, celebrities, athletes collecting. Yeah.
It's happened before, and it'll happen again. I think is a nice theme, like people coming in and out of the hobby. We all have, like, I wasn't collecting in my high school and early college years. I just, it's great to see people coming in and out, especially the stature of people like Charlie Sheen and other celebrities. But you wrapped up the book with a story that is more closer to home and shows the kind of the cycle of collecting within your life. And it relates to your two sons, your twin boys, and their pursuit of Aaron Judge's autograph, which in today's modern landscape has to be a pretty difficult sign to get.
Yeah, well, this was 2019, and Judge was the guy at the time, right? So his autographed baseball single sign were going for $400 or $500 at that particular time, and my kids were going to turn 10, and so and they turned 10 in late May. So in March, I approached them and I said, "Hey guys, this is your last time, being in single digits. You're hitting a big milestone. You turn 10 in March. So what do you want for your birthday? Tell dad and mom what you want." And they both universally said, "We want to get Aaron Judge's autograph." And I thought, well, that's easy. I can buy that. And, but they're like, "We want to get it ourselves, Dad. We want to meet Aaron Judge." And I did my best to talk them out. Yeah, I did. I did my best to talk them out of the meeting Aaron Judge part. I can get you his autograph, but I really can't get you to meet him.
No way. The hyper focus of a, soon to be 10-year-old boy, or two 10-year-old boys.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. They weren't
locked in.
Yeah. They were locked in. They weren't going to take anything less than meeting him. So, I thought long and hard about how could I possibly make this happen. I didn't want to just tell them it wasn't going to happen. So I thought about it and I thought, well, you know what? I'll go back to my roots. The Yankees are coming to town to play the Orioles, and why not, find out where the Orioles stay, and I'll get a room at that hotel while they're in town. I mean, how could I not get Aaron Judge's autograph? I mean, how could the kids fail if we're staying in the hotel? I mean, that's certainly a formula for success if ever there was one.
And that was the way you did it back in Chicago. When the visiting teams would come in, you'd plaster yourself outside the doorsteps of the hotel.
You had the blueprint.
I had the blueprint, and I thought, now I've got the advantage of that experience as a kid, and then on top of that, we're going to be in the hotel, so there was no way we were going to fail. Well, anyway, I did get reservations, and we were staying at the Baltimore Inner Harbor Hotel. and it was the Four Seasons Baltimore Inner Harbor Hotel. The most money I've ever paid for a single night at a hotel. It was a Saturday night, and when I called up, I said, "Hey, do you have a room for this particular date, Saturday, the such and such of April?" And she said, "Well, I'm sorry, sir, we're all sold out, but we do have one room left." I'm like, "Well, whatever that is, I'll take it." "Oh, okay. Well, it's the presidential suite."
Knew that was coming.
Yeah.
Got you at your most vulnerable moment.
Yeah. So, I'm paying this exorbitant amount of money that I have to justify to my wife, but it's all for the experience, right? So
It's for the boys.
it's
all
for
right?
the boys. Yeah, it's for the boys. So we get there and I timed it perfectly. I mean, I already knew, from my previous experience, what time the bus is going to show up. We drive up and the team bus is outside the hotel. I'm like, "Kids, we're not even going to get up to the room. You guys get your pen in hands, get those baseballs out. We're going into the lobby. Dad will be checking in while you guys start getting autographs." So that's what we did. The kids have their Yankee jerseys on. They look cute as a button. They go into the lobby. I start pointing to players as they're walking through to get to the bus. And I'm at the front desk checking in just as the kids are turning around to go for their first autograph. And I have my back to him for a moment and I hear this voice, "No autographs." And this guy screamed, I could hear it from across the room. And I turned around and I looked and Colby is running back to me. He's got tears in his eyes. And I'm looking at this guy who yelled at him. He's like 6'8". He looked like a retired, New York City police officer and just looked mean as hell. And I go up to him and I said, and by this time I just got my key, my room key. And I held the room key up and I said, "We're staying here. Is there a problem?" And he goes, "There's no autographs. I don't care if you're staying here or not." And that's how it went. We ended up, I talked to the hotel manager and he said, "Yes, sir, indeed. It doesn't matter if you're staying here. If you want autographs, you'll have to go outside and stand across over there where all those autograph chasers are. That's where you'll have to go get them." So even though we had full access to the hotel, we had no access to the players. And so we did end up staying over there the next morning. We did see Aaron Judge leave. We never got Aaron Judge. We got like two Phil Nevin, one of the coaches,
Tulowitzki,
and one of the announcers signed
Michael
for us,
K.
Michael K.
Yeah, this is the difference in 5 decades of autograph collecting, right?
Yes, it is.
So, today it has been completely monetized. And you mentioned the fact in the book that, and is absolutely true, that autograph chasers will even hire children to secure autographs from these celebrities. When I worked at Upper Deck and Michael Jordan had his basketball camp, he would sign autographs as part of that. People would enlist the children, the kids at the camp, to get autographs for them, for obviously for resale purposes. It runs deep because there's so much money involved.
Yeah.
And you hit it on the head with the fact that you actually, were reflective about it in a way that was ultimately positive, even though unfortunately your son's had a bad experience, which I hope doesn't stick with them forever. But the fact that this is kind of the necessary process now for athletes to protect their brand, their value, and their time, basically.
Yeah, I mean, their sanity, because I mean, and I do point it out. It was actually, I didn't go to the hotel to get the epilogue for Volume 2, but it ended up being the perfect epilogue for Volume 2. That whole story of what happened. And of course, we go into much greater detail in the epilogue, but it really was a great way to end, the two volume set of Waiting for a Sign, because it does give a complete perspective on, I started out at a time of innocence when the question I would get asked all the time, by players, and it was, I got asked it a million times, was, "Hey kid, what do you do with these things?" Like guys would be rifling through 10 baseball cards as they're signing them, and they're asking me, "What do you do with these things?" And I didn't know how to answer, other than to say, I save them, because there was no money in it. I did it because I loved it. I loved collecting autographs. I wanted to be a baseball player. I idolize these guys. I did it for all the right reasons. And now when they're signing autographs, they don't know who they're signing for. They don't know if they're signing for a fan. They don't know if they're signing for someone who's just trying to get a buck off of them. And the real thing is, it's not even protecting their brand or their value, because let's face it, Tom Brady can sign autographs 24 hours a day. The value is not going to go down, right? Like, it's just not going to go down. But imagine this. So imagine that that I'm doing it to put those balls on eBay. And Aaron Judge comes in the lobby, and I have him sign 2 balls for my kids. And Aaron Judge signs the 2 balls, and I get a photograph on my phone as he's signing the balls. And as soon as he walks away, I take that photograph with the balls and I Snapchat it. $500 in each for these Aaron Judge signed baseballs, and they're sold. So then people were like, well, how did you get those? Well, I was in the lobby of this. I got these today. And the next thing you know, the Yankees, wherever they go, they're going to have autograph chasers who are making a living doing this, because those 2 baseballs would have paid for my weekend activities in Baltimore, right? They would have paid for the hotel. They would have paid for the food. So why not just, stay with the team on the road wherever they go and get autographs? And the players would have absolutely no sanity. They'd have no sanctuary.
And I think that's why it's turned into a private game. And guys like Upper Deck have entered, and Jeff Rosenberg with TriStar, and done deals with guys, authenticating them along the way. PSA has a big business with that. If Jordan is going to sign autographs, it's going to be for Upper Deck. And he can easily point and say, I don't sign autographs outside that deal. And if it's not a Upper Deck authenticated or subsequently authenticated by PSA, in his case, he'd be probably saying Upper Deck because of his arrangement. He can say it's not real. And so that's saving him time and hassle from having to sign out in the open market. But it's really become obviously a big industry, something that we're part of.
Yeah.
And so I have to ask you, did they end up getting Aaron Judge autographed baseballs out of this whole thing?
They did, because Dad coughed up the money. And
of course.
And
there
I
it
knew
is.
that.
But I did get a good deal on the baseballs.
Right.
I found a couple for less than the full retail price, but yeah, they did get them. But like I said, it was a great experience for everybody. And it was a fun way to end the book, and to point out that, I was really blessed to come up in the autograph world when I did, when things were really simple, and I was considered, very strange at the time. And, I've said before that a lot of my friends in high school said, we used to think you were crazy. Now we think you were a genius, because I was doing it when it didn't matter to anybody. And I was really ahead of the game. But I really lucked into that, and it was a blessing. And now it's just different. But it doesn't mean that that if you want to collect autographs, it's any less rewarding, because it's still just as rewarding. I mean, if you go to look at the National, Steve, we just left the National, and Jeff Rosenberg had 150 signers. And if you were back there watching the looks on people's faces when they'd get the autograph, even if
Run TMC was there, I was transported back to 1990 in my childhood in the Bay Area, rooting for those guys. I was in the same room as them. It was so cool.
Yeah,
they were signing autographs. I was just like, I was transported. It was like a time machine. It was awesome.
It is, and even for the people paying money, the getting the autograph, no matter how you do it, it's just such a rush. And then you have that physical piece of memory, that you can take with you for the rest of your life, and you'll always have that moment, which connects you to that person. That's what makes autographs special.
It does. Actually, even, this is going to be a little bit off the topic from athletes, but I like it from my older relatives. Cards from my grandmother, one of my grandmothers who's passed away. I pull it out every once in a while and look at her signature. And maybe that's because I'm in collecting and things like that, but it takes me back to my childhood with someone who's very important to me. Yeah. So it is something that's really a moment of their life. And we talked about that in the last episode with you, Kevin. But I want to thank you for coming on, Kevin. Again, the book is Waiting for a Sign Volume 2, Highlights and Inside Stories from a Lifetime of Collecting Baseball Autographs. The author is Kevin Keating, PSA's principal authenticator. And of course, the website, if you're interested in purchasing the book, is waitingforasignedbook.com, waitingforasignedbook.com. Thank you, Kevin, for joining us.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Thank you again, Kevin. And we will be back again next week with more here on the PSA Pod.